Hello, this is Dr. Llewellyn Eisen, and this is our second of 3 short lectures on the topic of Christian worship, getting in and staying in. As you know, 2 of our goals for this unit are to consider the core groups of early Christian communities, which we did, and the core rituals of early Christian liturgy, which we are just about to do, having in the last lecture defined ritual and having defined liturgy. So the primary sources for this unit are come from our authors Justin Martyr, who was a Roman apologist and intellectual, from Tertullian, a North African apologist and intellectual, and from the Didascalia Apostolorum, a Syrian anonymous text which likely had an authorship of multiple people. So, the first of our core rituals of early Christian liturgy that we're going to consider is baptism. Baptism is something that was known among a large range of religions in the Hellenistic world, including Judaism. It involved immersion in water, or in some cases, as we saw in the Taurobolium, in blood. Blood could also be used as a cleansing mechanism. Regardless of whether an individual was using blood or using water, it was understood as the liquid itself was understood as a cleansing mechanism, and it symbolized purification, it symbolized death, and it symbolized resurrection. We see something of a baptism in one of the biblical passages that I asked you to read for the first lesson, which is Leviticus. In this passage, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the ritual for the leprous person at the time of his or her cleansing. That person shall be brought to the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall make an examination." Notice that I've highlighted if the disease is healed in the leprous person. The priest shall command that 2 living clean birds and cedar wood and crimson yarn and hyssop be brought for the one who is to be cleansed. The priest shall command that one of the birds be slaughtered, shall take the living bird with the cedar wood and the crimson yarn and the hyssop, and dip them and the bird in the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. The priest shall sprinkle it 7 times on the one who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease. Then the priest shall announce the person clean, and the priest shall let the living bird go into the open field. The one who is to be cleansed shall wash their clothes and shave off their hair and bathe themselves in water, and they shall be clean. So notice this isn't talking about curing the disease of leprosy. This is talking about a baptism that is to signal to the community that the person is acceptable to move among them. So New Testament texts don't really describe much of baptisms. Baptisms were done. Paul does cite them. The sacrament seems to include immersion in living water, some kind of formulaic profession, and it's unclear the age of the people who are being baptized. Are they adults? Are they infants? Are they youth? In time, any water is going to be sufficient, not just necessarily living water, because the belief that will be that any kind of water that's used changes fundamentally when it's used in the ritual of baptism. We have a very clear passage about baptism when Jesus is baptized. In Mark 1:4-5, we read that John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. People from the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to him and were baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. So again, I've highlighted things worth noting that the baptism is proclaimed as something that has to do with repentance. This isn't just oh, I am part of this community now. One is renouncing what would be considered, I suppose, bad behavior. And that's a part of that. They confess their sins, and then the ritual takes place. Baptism is considered among early Christian communities a non-repeatable sacrament, which means that it's done once. We can see from these ancient baptistries that you don't have a single standard for how the baptism is to be done. But in 2 of the 3 cases, we can see clearly a shape of a cross. Here you can see stairs on this side. A catechumenate would be on this side. There would be people on either side to help them remove their clothing. Baptisms were done nude. They would go down the stairs. There would be someone on either side to help the person go down into the water, and then they would come up the other side where they would be assisted by someone who would clothe them in clean, dry clothing. So it's a process that takes a community, right? And I think this is important to acknowledge, is that baptism isn't just simply about the person who's being baptized, but it's also about the community receiving the person who is baptized, who would very often be given a new name as a sign of their rebirth. In time, questions emerge about baptisms, and in fact, many people still have these questions today. Should one be baptized as an infant or as an adult? I suppose the answer to this has to do with whether or not an individual makes a decision themselves to be baptized, or whether that's a decision that a person is even able to make. Some Christian communities, as you can see here in this picture here, baptize people who are cognizant of what is happening. On the other hand, in this image here, I think this child is cognizant of something happening. I'm not sure they're cognizant of what exactly is happening. They're clearly not pleased. But Christian communities will divide over this question of, is baptism something that is done to someone, or is baptism something that they freely choose themselves? Other questions, is it only once, or is it something that can be repeated? Initially, in early Christian communities, baptism is considered a non-repeatable sacrament. Naturally, this meant that people put off baptism until such a time as they were nearly, dead or dying. In that case, it was assumed that if a person sinned after baptism, then there was no real hope for them, and so they would put off baptism until the end of their lifetime. The types of people who would do this would be very often people in the military who had to do things like kill enemies, or people like emperors and empresses who had to make decisions that could impact people in horrible ways, or would be considered immoral. And so they would put off baptism until they were dying. Did this mean that they were not Christian until they were dying? No, because remember that Christianity isn't something that is dependent on baptism or the Eucharist. It's a question of identity, really. Should baptism happen after a denominational shift? This is a modern question, right? So if someone has been Lutheran all their life and then they decide to be Orthodox, will they need to be baptized? Sometimes the answer to this depends on the community or even the individual priest. Some denominations will expect that a person who has joined their denomination, even if they've been Christian their whole life, they need to be baptized. Other communities will accept Christian converts into their denomination, will accept their baptism as valid. Full immersion or drops. Is a person to be fully immersed into a pool of water, even living water, or are simply a few sprinkles of water acceptable? In time, the theology that will emerge will argue that it's what God does with the water not the water itself that will matter. But again, some denominations will insist on full immersion. Another question, living or still water. There are some Christian groups that will insist that an individual be baptized in living water, meaning not an ocean, but a river or water that's come from a natural source. And others that will argue that, I mean, this is clearly like a pool here, right? And this is obviously a kettle drum. But not all communities agree that this is acceptable. And then finally, is baptism even necessary for salvation? This is a trickier question. Some will argue that it is essential for salvation, while others will make the case that no, if, for example, if an infant dies without baptism, are they saved or not? And, you know, this is a difficult question. Ultimately, one cannot know, right? Because answering the question depends on whether or not a person even agrees that Christianity is a religion that is right. The second key sacrament in the early Christian community is the Eucharist, which is a Greek word that means thanksgiving. Eucharista or Eucharisto, meaning thanksgiving or thank you. So a central focus of Christian liturgical life is the celebration of the Eucharist. And this is a tradition that will emerge within the Hellenistic tradition of communal meals. But in the case of the Christian Eucharist, it has the intention of remembering a specific event, which makes it unique among communal meals alongside the Passover event on which it is, for the most part, based. We read this passage in Exodus 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat of it. Your lamb shall be without blemish. And this is a line here, your lamb shall be without blemish, that Christian apologists or theologians will later refer to as evidence that this is a reference to the figure of Jesus as a Messiah. A year-old male, you shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation shall slaughter it at twilight. Take some of the blood, put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat. They shall eat the lamb that night, eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted with its head, legs, and inner organs. Let none of it remain. It is the Passover of the Lord. I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, strike down every firstborn, both human beings and animals. Here's where Marcion, by the way, is, objecting to the God of the Hebrew Bible. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you. It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for the Lord passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when the Lord struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses. So we will see this ritual meal, continuing into the age of Jesus among the Jesus movement. We read it in the Matthew passage when Jesus finished saying all these things. He said, after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Go into the city to a certain man and say, the teacher says my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. So here we see Jesus engaging in this same exact traditional meal, of which Paul will write to the Corinthians when he's arguing about them coming together to eat. For I received from the Lord what I handed to you, that the Lord on the night when he was betrayed took a loaf of bread. When he'd given thanks, he broke and said, this is my body. Do this in remembrance. He took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. So here we have Paul arguing on behalf of a meal that is in remembrance of the Passover meal, which will in time, in decades, and in centuries be known as the Eucharist, a repeatable sacrament, a sacrament that Christians will engage in when they come together to eat, in which eating becomes a form of historical memory. So Christians will engage in this behavior like Jews in their Passover meal. It's a different kind of meal. And the point, of course, is, as we discussed in the last lesson, that rituals socialize people into religious communities. They are a way of making meaning. And if we think of eating as a form of historical memory, if we think that that's kind of ridiculous, we do this all the time. We do this every Thanksgiving when we sit down, every November, when we sit down to our Thanksgiving meal. And we may think rather patriotically that this is a way that we celebrate a component of American history. We may also think of it as a familial historical event where we gather together with certain foods that are always there, the hideous green bean casserole that no one likes, the turkey that half of the family doesn't eat because they're vegetarian, and yet it needs to be there. In time, baptism and the Eucharist are going to be known as sacramental components of early Christian communities. They will be known as a sacrament or as a mystery. For Augustine, an early Christian theologian, a sacrament will be defined by him as a visible sign of invisible grace. Baptism and the Eucharist will be actions that are visible behaviors, visible signs of things that are invisible to us. In time, in addition to baptism and the Eucharist, there will be sacraments of marriage, of confirmation, so the acknowledgement of an individual's full participation as an adult, the sacrament of holy orders, which will be something that will emerge in later centuries when an individual decides not to be married but to be part of a monastic community. The sacrament of penance and the sacrament of last rites. These will be sort of the traditional 7 sacraments of, in most cases, of Western Christianity. Other aspects of other Christian groups will not be interested in putting a number on sacraments, but will prefer really to think of life as being sacramental. In many ways, sacraments, whether they're visible or invisible, are affirmations of Christian theology. They affirm that God touches human activity and humanity through material means. And we'll talk about the material means through which God touches humanity according to Christian theology in the third of the 3 lectures. But now what I want to do is I want to turn to the homework questions, which ask you to consider the writings of Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and the Didascalia Apostolorum that help us to understand what are central components of Christian gatherings. How are we seeing these rituals and these sacraments worked out when Christians come together? According to Justin Martyr, if you read carefully, which I hope you did, the types of behaviors that are central components of Christian gatherings include prayer, they include baptisms, they include fasting, they include the remission of sins. We saw the Holy Kiss of Peace, the Eucharist, offering of thanksgivings, things for which people are grateful, and of course, the collection of alms and the distribution of alms. In the Tertullian passage, we read that he encourages a disowning of the devil, offerings for the dead, and the consumption of milk and honey. And in the case of the Didascalia Apostolorum, we see evidence of excommunications, healing of the ill, specific seatings arrangements, behaviors that are expected in the service, gender distinctions, and sadly, denial of female authority. So we see this sort of refinement of what's expected as we progress from one century to the next, which of course is fairly typical as people get comfortable and recognize that, oh, okay, this is the system that we have right now. They're going to refine what they expect about who's in charge and why. So a second question for the homework was, what ethical behaviors are expected of Christians when they are not gathered together? And here I just want to highlight one of the three readings, which is that of Justin Martyr, who makes it very clear that when the ruler has given thanks and all the people have assented, those who are called by us deacons to give to each of those present a portion of the Eucharisticized bread and wine and water, and they carry it away to those who are absent. So this concern to care for those who are not there is very clear. And I think it's a nice reminder that for Christian theology, the act of worship and engagement in community is not just about those who are present, but those who are not present either. And it also stresses the important role of the deacons and the deaconesses. The final question in the homework was, how are Christian communities adapting to the prevailing Roman culture? We see three clear ways in which they are adapting, and I'm going to explore those a little bit more in the next lesson. But the three ways that I want to highlight is in their worship and communal architecture, which Christians will transform to suit their own needs, in their use of liturgical time, in their reworking of the calendar, and in their veneration of the holy dead. So that will be the focus of the third lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at isenbl@plu.edu, and I'll see you soon.